tantissimi per questa terza lezione di Formarsi in Nazione, organizzata, come sapete, dalla Fondazione Fare Futuro, e una serie di lezioni che ci accompagneranno fino a maggio del 2021, quindi ne avremo per un bel po'. Io, per chi non mi conosce, sono Laura Hart, sono membro del comitato scientifico e cercherò di moderare al meglio questo dibattito, ringraziando ovviamente innanzitutto il senatore Adolfo Urso dell'onore e anche della fiducia che mi ha data in questa occasione. Vi dico anche, confesso di essere un poco nervosa, quindi spero di non deludervi, spero soprattutto che mi perdonerete se non passa tutto liscio come nelle lezioni coordinate dal senatore Urso stesso. Allora, come annunciato, questa lezione è veramente di una rilevanza molto importante in questo momento. Si terrà sostanzialmente in 3 blocchi. Avremo la relazione introduttiva del dottor Lohmann sulle politiche degli Stati Uniti verso l'Asia e verso la Cina, che si terrà in inglese. Dopodiché seguirà una breve sintesi in italiano di quanto ha detto il dottor Lohmann. Seguirà poi l'intervento dell'ambasciatore Giulio Maria Terzi di Sant'Agata in italiano. Dopo speriamo di avere qualche tempo anche per delle domande in inglese al relatore principale. Proveremo ovviamente a dare la parola a più persone possibili, per cui vi chiedo gentilmente di tenere comunque tutte le domande brevi e anche molto concreti. Chi vuole può segnalare la sua richiesta per una domanda nella chat di questa piattaforma. Vi chiedo quindi gentilmente di riservare la chat solo a tale scopo. A chi poi vorrebbe fare una domanda ma magari in italiano si può anche scrivere tranquillamente nella stessa chat e cercherò poi di proporla al nostro relatore in inglese. Teniamo ovviamente presente che abbiamo concordato un tempo massimo per questa lezione di 1 ora, quindi vi ringrazio d'anticipo per la vostra pazienza e ovviamente la vostra comprensione. Ora passiamo al dunque. Mio immenso piacere introdurvi al relatore di questa sera, il nostro ospite d'onore e l'ambasciatore Terzi mi perdonerà, è il dottor Walter Lohmann, direttore del Centro Studi Asiatici della Heritage Foundation. Fondata nel 1973, la Heritage Foundation è la più grande istituzione educativa e di ricerca conservatrice degli Stati Uniti, con al centro della sua missione la promozione della libera impresa, un governo limitato, la libertà individuale, i valori americani tradizionali e una forte difesa nazionale. Il Centro Studi Asiatici diretto dal dottor Lohmann è il più antico centro di ricerca della Fondazione e fu fondata nel 1983. Ora, il curriculum del dottor Lohmann è davvero troppo ricco per percorrerlo tutto, ma vi faccio una breve sintesi. Attualmente nel suo ruolo di analista politico si concentra soprattutto sulle relazioni degli Stati Uniti con i suoi alleati in Giappone, Corea del Sud e Australia, nonché con l'India e i paesi del sud-est asiatico. È anche la voce principale di Heritage sulle relazioni tra gli Stati Uniti e Taiwan ed è un attento osservatore della politica cinese, un ospite quindi d'eccellenza per parlarci del tema di questa sera, della parola d'ordine Pacifico. Inoltre, riconoscendo la forza dei legami storici e culturali dell'America con l'Europa, negli ultimi anni Lohmann ha anche guidato lo sforzo della Heritage Foundation per incoraggiare un migliore coordinamento in tutte queste aree con alleati e partner transatlantici. Dal 2013 inoltre è anche professore a contratto presso la Georgetown University, dove insegna sugli interessi di politica estera americana nel sud-est asiatico e sul ruolo del Congresso americano nella politica asiatica. In precedenza ha servito su Capitol Hill, quindi al Congresso americano, prima come consigliere politico lo conosciamo bene, senatore John McCain, e poi come consigliere del senatore Jesse Helms, capo della delegazione repubblicana nella Commissione Affari Esteri. So, dear Dr. Lohmann, after this brief introduction in Italian, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. As announced, the topic for this evening is U.S. policies towards China and Asia. And I think just a week after the presidential elections in the United States, the question on many minds right now is obviously whether we are to expect any changes in the near future. I am sure you will be able to give us some insight. So thank you again for being with us. I'm also happy to remember that we are together on this very symbolic day in which we celebrate 31 years of the fall of the Berlin Wall. So I hope that brings good luck to us this evening. So Dr. Lohmann, the floor is yours.
Great. Buonasera, everyone, and grazie mille, Laura. Thanks for that. I'm very honored to be here. You know, I have actually a special connection to Italy because my wife is from Rome. She was born and raised in Rome, moved to the United States to go to college. And for the first 3 times I ever left the United States, I only went to Italy. So I went to Italy the first time I went to Europe. I went there the second time, the third time before I went anyplace else, actually anyplace else in Europe or the rest of the world. So I love Italy. I'm very glad to be doing this today. Thank you also to Ambassador Terzi and Senator Urzo for hosting me. I appreciate it, and I'm honored by the request. I'm going to try to be relatively brief, maybe just 10 minutes or so. But I want to touch on just a few elements here. Trump's policy that has been to date, a Biden policy, what it might look like, and then a couple of things on Congress and trade. So first off, I want to start with something that may sound like a conventional view of Trump's foreign policy, especially his Asia policy. And I know from experience talking to friends in Europe that it's unconventional, but I think that the facts have borne out that it wasn't a disaster. Okay, it wasn't as bad as everyone thought it might be, friends in Europe, when it came to Asia. You could have a different expert to talk about where the administration is on Europe policy, but on Asia, it was not the end of the world to have Trump in power for 4 years. In fact, it was more continuity between the Trump administration and the administration that came before him and Barack Obama. And where it is different, I think that it reflects a broad bipartisan consensus, especially on China. And we can talk some more detail about that China policy in particular. You still have American alliances in the region. You still have our military forward deployed in the region. We have some issues to work out with, especially Japan and South Korea, about the terms under which our troops are deployed there. But those talks have been ongoing, a little bit contentious, I think, in the case of South Korea. But it hasn't resulted in the United States pulling its troops out. It's only resulted in a continuing extension of them over the last year as we negotiate the terms. Japan, we're approaching the time where we'll be renegotiating with Japan too. And we enter that negotiation, I think, with the alliance in good shape. I think in both cases, the alliance is in good shape, despite some media signs occasionally to the contrary. You've continued to have a diplomatic activity in the region. You've continued to have secretaries of state and defense traveling to Seoul and Tokyo and Canberra and other places in the region. In some ways, the policy has improved over where it was in the Obama administration. I would say, sort of geographically speaking, Taiwan, the policy is better in Taiwan from my perspective, stronger, more supportive of Taiwan. It is more supportive of Taiwan than any time in the last at least 20 years, maybe 40 years. And in the Pacific Islands, I think this administration took some initial steps by the Obama administration to expand its profile, diplomatic profile, especially in the Pacific Islands, which is important. And then on defense budgets, you know, without strong defense budgets, shipbuilding, readiness accounts, things that really matter to the military, without commitments there, the United States is a much weaker power in the region. And the Trump administration led really 5 consecutive years because they revised the first budget 5 years of increases in defense spending in the areas where it's needed the most. On China, I think it's fair to say that, that the Trump administration broke with the Obama time to some extent. But in that regard, it was only the leading edge, I think, of where Washington is on China generally. It was a change that was frankly long overdue. That is a toughening of our policy on China, and would have probably been implemented one way or another, whoever had come into power. In fact, there were a lot of stories at the time that the Chinese were more worried about Hillary Clinton becoming president because she had already a track record on China that they didn't like very much. So that's it for Trump. But I think it's a good place to build when talking about where a Biden administration will go. Now, if the court cases go well for Trump and there's a change and somehow he ends up being president another 4 years, I think you will have more of the same. You'll have more of the same policy that you've had for the last 4 years. If Biden comes in, I think for the most part, he will build on a lot of that. He will continue America's traditional commitments to the region, alliances, forward deployment. The changed attitude on China, I think, will continue. I think that a Biden administration would be more like, say, the strategy that Trump laid out in 2017 than he would be like what Obama did back in 2015, this kind of strategy that Obama had. I don't think that the U.S. under President Biden will go back to that kind of Obama type of engagement with China, pulling our punches, sort of refraining from certain activities like freedom of navigation operations and that sort of thing. I don't think a Biden administration will do that. I think that they will continue to be tough. Of course, there's going to be some change in style, some change in rhetoric. You're not going to see the kind of rhetoric that has been coming out of the State Department in the last year or so. But in substance, I think the policy will be very similar. Just 2 points I want to make here. One is that this is contingent on some differences being worked out within the Biden camp. So there are at least 2 different teams within Biden world, if you want to call it that, or the Biden team, foreign policy team. There are the people who are tough and want to remain tough on China. People like Eli Ratner and Kirk Campbell. And then there are people who want to tack back in the direction where Obama was. They're not going to go all the way back there, but there are people that want to be more cooperative with China. And so we're going to have to see how those battles play out as they form a government. And then the other big thing, an uncertainty really, is where we do go on defense budgets. Like I mentioned earlier, how central that is to the U.S. Profile in the region, the U.S. defense presence, its military. And there's some uncertainty, I think, with how our budgets go forward, because we're dealing with an unprecedented level of debt following COVID. There are probably going to be cuts across the board in U.S. government spending and somewhere or another. And Democrats are generally known for being less sympathetic to high spending on defense. And so we will have to make some decisions whether to pull back in other areas and prioritize Asia or lower our profile in Asia, or, there's some difficult decisions to make there. But like I said, when it's all said and done, I think there will be more in common between a Biden administration and a Trump administration on Asia than differences, very similar to the way that Trump built on the Obama years. I want to make a point about Congress. We also had an election for Congress. And so, the United States has become so executive oriented over the last decades, really, 100 years. You can count how you want if you're a historian, but it's very executive oriented. And now with the media, we're even focused us more closely on the executive branch, on the presidency. As a matter of fact, the night of the election, I was watching on CNN. They never talked about any of the House or the Senate races. I don't think they mentioned the House or the Senate all night until I turned the channel and started watching somewhere that did talk about the House and the Senate. There were other stations that focused on it a little bit, but that's how closely we follow the presidency now. Do not pay as much attention to the House and Senate. But there were outcomes there, I think, that will be important. I think if the Republicans keep the Senate, I think that there will be more pressure on Biden to be tough on China. You will have this constant commentary coming from the Senate, and most of it will be negative. Most of it will be, no matter what he does, it will be too weak. Everyone will complain about him on the Republican side, and that will help, I think, the hardliners or the tougher line inside the Biden administration. I think that will help them make their case. On the other hand, if the Democrats end up controlling the Senate, I think that gives Biden more room, and it probably helps the more dovish members of his administration. The House, of course, was decided. The House will be a Democrat, so that was never that in play. And then the last point here to make is on trade issues. I think trade is an entirely separate basket of factors to consider, and where Biden is. It's even where Trump is. It was never a part of China policy. It was really never a part of Asia policy, which is a problem in some ways. It was its own set of issues with its own constituencies, its own dynamics in Washington. And I think that will continue. I think you actually have bipartisan cooperation on trade issues as they regard China, as they regard Asia, on trade generally, because Washington has become very, I would say, protectionist oriented. I mean, I'm a free trader, so I use loaded terms like that when I talk about the other side, but I do think that it will become more protectionist oriented. I don't see a lot of prospect for lifting sanctions, especially some of the sanctions on China. We may work around some of the steel and aluminum tariffs that are now global, but I think once you impose tariffs, they're very hard to take off because they build constituencies and interests of their own. Where we have to look to see where they're headed exactly, that is a Biden administration, look to their appointments. The United States Trade Representative in particular, there's some names being tossed around on both sides, some much more left-leaning, labor-oriented, people focused on the environment as opposed to trade itself, and then some other more traditional, mainstream, middle-of-the-road Democrat trade policy specialists who see what they end up with. My bet is that they will have someone from the left, someone more protectionist-oriented, more focused on labor and environment issues than they will someone that's a traditional trade policy person. And that will actually hurt our profile in Asia because, part of the problem it presents is you can't strike a deal when the price is just way too high, higher than anyone's willing to pay. And so I think we continue without a trade policy really for Asia for a while. And we can talk in the discussion here, we can talk about what that means exactly, because of course we will have some kind of things going on in trade. But I don't think they add up to the sort of robust policy that you need in order to be as relevant in the lives of the people there that you need to be. I've got some more I could talk about, but why don't I leave it there and sit back and listen to Ambassador Terzi, and then hopefully we'll get into some question and answer.
Thank you very much, Director Lohmann. As promised, now I will try to synthesize what you said briefly in Italian before giving the floor to Ambassador Terzi, obviously. So first of all, scusate, devo passare all'italiano. Il direttore Lohmann comunque ha tenuto a ricordare il suo legame molto forte con l'Italia. La sua moglie è nata qua a Roma, tutti i suoi primi viaggi li ha fatti in Italia, quindi sente un legame molto forte con il nostro paese e credo sia importante tradurre anche questa parte, ecco. Praticamente ha parlato di 3 grandi temi: le politiche del presidente Trump verso l'Asia e poi la Cina, poi le politiche prevedibili, quanto si possa prevedere sulle politiche del futuro presidente Biden, e infine anche il ruolo del Congresso americano. Sulle politiche di Trump verso l'Asia ha detto che certamente non era un disastro come spesso ci è stato prospettato in Europa, anche sulla stampa europea forse. Ha detto che c'è molto più continuità tra l'amministrazione Trump e l'amministrazione Obama di quanto non si pensi, e laddove le politiche di Trump sono state divergenti da quelle di Obama di prima, in realtà non è solo una decisione di Trump, ma viene da una forte spinta bipartisan del Congresso americano, che comunque ha cambiato visione su alcune questioni. Quando parliamo dell'Asia in generale, delle questioni, ha detto, aperti con Corea del Sud, con il Giappone, in particolare sui termini della manutenzione delle truppe americane, ma ha sottolineato che tuttavia c'è un dialogo in corso e che le alleanze nella regione sono forti. Su alcuni punti la presidenza Trump ha sicuramente perseguita una politica migliore di quella del presidente Obama, soprattutto per quanto riguarda la questione di Taiwan, dove gli Stati Uniti ora hanno la politica più forte in sostegno a Taiwan di quanto non è stato negli ultimi 40 anni, e poi sulle isole pacifiche. Un altro punto molto importante riguarda il budget della difesa, ma anche tipo la costruzione delle navi, che hanno avuto dall'amministrazione Trump un forte sostegno, e questo comunque, la difesa è una questione centrale per quanto riguarda le relazioni nella regione asiatica. Poi la più grande rottura con l'epoca Obama sicuramente è stata sulla Cina, però come già accennato ha seguito un cambiamento generale di impostazione a Washington DC, un cambiamento bipartisan. Quindi per quanto riguarda le politiche prevedibili di Biden, in questo momento il direttore Lohmann pensa che continuerà in grandi linee su quelle tracciate in questa ultima amministrazione. Sicuramente la Cina pensa che seguirà una linea più come quella del presidente Trump nel 2017 che non quella di Obama nel 2015, quindi prevede una politica che rimarrà assertiva, ma certamente prevede cambiamenti nella retorica. Però appunto in sostanza la politica non dovrebbe essere troppo diversa, dipende però da una questione comunque, che nel campo di Biden ci sono 2 squadre, possiamo dire, di 2 linee sulla politica estera, una che possiamo definire un po' come i falchi, una linea più dura, gli altri sono più obamaniani e potrebbero quindi spingere per una politica più di cooperazione con la Cina. La grande questione della politica di Biden, anche per quanto riguarda la regione del Pacifico, riguarderà il budget per la difesa. Su questo ancora c'è grande incertezza. I democratici ovviamente non hanno la stessa attenzione a quel tema come il partito repubblicano, e poi anche dovuto, diciamo, alla crisi del Covid ci saranno dei tagli un po' dappertutto, quindi ci sarà da vedere se sul budget, sulla difesa, si investirà poi sull'Asia o invece su altre regioni. Questo ovviamente avrà un peso per quanto gli Stati Uniti potranno fare. Comunque, in sintesi, quindi prevede che ci sarà una politica verso l'Asia che abbia più in comune con le politiche di Trump che non divergenze. Infine ha chiesto attenzione anche appunto sul congresso americano, abbiamo già accennato a questa spinta bipartisan comunque, soprattutto per quanto riguarda la Cina. Lì c'è la grande questione: se il Partito Repubblicano riesce a mantenere la maggioranza al Senato, ci sarà più pressione sul presidente Biden per continuare la linea dura verso la Cina, e quindi potrebbe aiutare i cosiddetti falchi all'interno della squadra di Biden. Se il Partito Repubblicano dovesse perdere la maggioranza al Senato, c'è il rischio che vince invece la linea più morbida, più soft del Partito Democratico. Infine, una grande questione riguarda le politiche del commercio. Il direttore Lohmann ha sottolineato che un grande problema è che queste politiche non hanno mai veramente fatto parte delle politiche verso l'Asia, e la Cina prevede che questo problema purtroppo continuerà, e comunque la mancanza di una politica, diciamo, commerciale degli Stati Uniti verso l'Asia, verso la Cina, è un problema anche per una politica forte su tutta la linea. Però anche lì pare esserci un consenso sempre maggiore all'interno delle diverse forze politiche americane, che sempre più si possano definire protezioniste sull'America. Quindi da un lato prevede che le sanzioni, che già ora ci sono anche le tariffe verso la Cina, sicuramente rimarranno, e ci chiede di seguire con attenzione le nomine, per esempio quello del segretario del commercio, per capire un po' la linea che ci possiamo aspettare, se sarà una linea più mainstream o se sarà una linea, come il direttore teme, più di sinistra, di una sinistra più radicale, diciamo, di persone che vengono fuori dal mondo ambientalista o dai sindacati. Ecco, questo la sintesi di quanto ci ha raccontato il direttore Lohmann. E ora è mio piacere ovviamente dare la parola all'ambasciatore Giulio Maria Terzi di Sant'Agata, che tutti voi conoscete, già ministro degli esteri, nonché già rappresentante permanente alle Nazioni Unite a New York, ambasciatore a Washington DC e anche a Gerusalemme. Ho anche l'onore personale di lavorare con lui in altri contesti, come il Global Committee for the Rule of Law Marco Pannella. È un grandissimo animatore delle campagne a difesa dello Stato di diritto e i diritti umani, e senza dubbio uno delle voci più autorevoli sulle politiche del Partito Comunista Cinese anche in Italia. Giulio, grazie di essere con noi, a te la parola.
Thank you very much, Laura. I'm very happy that you did. When you are mentioning a voice in support of, and then you mentioned the Chinese Communist Party, I was a little bit afraid that the connection, is in fact, there is a connection, but it is exactly as it came out from your definition. Thank you very much, Dr. Lohmann. Really is a great pleasure. It's a great pleasure to have you here tonight as a director of prestigious Washingtonian, the most prestigious on Asia's policies, without making any comparison. But it's a great honor to have you here, and to have you here representing the Heritage Foundation. I anticipate the welcoming address that will be reserved to you by Senator Urso, but since I'm also a member of Fare Futuro Foundation, I would like really to repeat our gratitude for having you here and for having expressed in a very concise way, but extremely important for us to understand better the American complexity, but also a very clear-cut line and continuity in American positions vis-a-vis Asia, at least over the last 10, 15 years. And it is important, I think, that you speak to the people who are attending, people who are members of Fare Futuro, this organization, which is very much involved in foreign policy issues, and which has decided to organize a series of lessons, of conferences, of debates on the Italian national interest. Italian national interest means, as you know, Dr. Lehmann, Italian national interest means Atlantic national interest and European national interest. And starting with a focus among the geopolitical issues which are going to be dealt with in future discussion, to start with the Pacific region, it has a lot of meaning for us, because there is no doubt that the Pacific is the big challenge with China, is the big challenge that we have to face in the short and medium and perhaps in the long term. But we face this challenge with conviction, and we had the opportunity of exchanging some views also on other different occasions that you hosted as Heritage Foundation. We face these issues on a strong and firm basis of commonality of values and commonality of interest. And interest refer very clear to all the policies that remain in place, as you said, and I am convinced this is the truth, in fact, is it absolutely true, policies which remain in place on both sides of the Atlantic, whatever is the alternating success of political parties and administration, decided by freely elected parliaments. That is a very important point to understand in this very moment when there are still some uncertainties on where, in fact, America, the United States, is going to lead. Sorry, I'm switching to Italian, but perhaps don't have to be sorry, since my Italian, I hope, is better than my English. At least the pronunciation is going to be more acceptable. Dicevo a Dottor Lehmann che Pacifico significa, discutere di Pacifico significa, nel momento geopolitico attuale, in un momento trasformato profondamente dal coronavirus, capire bene e decidere tra paesi alleati come affrontare la grande sfida lanciata dalla Cina. Una Cina che sommessamente fino a un certo periodo, fino a una decina d'anni fa, e poi ostentatamente, sicuramente dal 2012, con l'insediamento di Xi Jinping al vertice di un potere assoluto e a vita, una Cina che ha lanciato, qualificandosi volutamente e chiedendo anche di essere riconosciuta come Cina comunista, ha lanciato una sfida all'Europa, all'intera democrazia liberale dell'Occidente, non solo dell'Occidente, abbiamo parlato delle democrazie nel Pacifico, che è simile, con sistemi, istituzioni simili alle nostre, ha lanciato una doppia sfida a livello ideologico e a livello strategico. A livello ideologico perché si collega apertamente, con fierezza e con volontà di proporre questo modello e qualche volta di imporlo sin dove è possibile, di imporre il suo modello di sviluppo economico, ma anche il suo sistema di potere al vertice del quale sta l'ideologia. Attenzione, non un'ideologia comunista moderna come sembrerebbe di poter credere, data l'elaborazione del suo sistema economico e finanziario, data l'evoluzione del suo sistema economico e finanziario, ma è un'ideologia che come modello di società e come modalità di controllo sulla popolazione e abolizione della libertà, imposizione della censura, è un'ideologia che si richiama direttamente al comunismo maoista-leninista. E la sfida è stata lanciata anche a un livello strategico di competizioni per un espansionismo globale dell'influenza del paese e degli interessi economici, che non esito a definire neoimperialista, una espansione potenziata ed affinata da un'enfasi sul principio della fusione civile e militare. Tale principio comprende e giustifica in ogni tipo di situazione, o giustifica qualsiasi cosa, direi, sul piano dell'intelligenza economica, dell'appropriazione di tecnologie, dello spionaggio, degli investimenti predatori, di collaborazioni mirate a sempre maggiori spazi di influenza, di reclutamento. Laura Hart ha scritto un importante articolo poco tempo fa su formiche e su altre pubblicazioni, su quella che è l'influenza politica attraverso l'acquisizione e il reclutamento di personalità, di scienziati, di imprenditori nel mondo scientifico, ma anche nel mondo della politica. E tutto questo è giustificato da Pechino con il paradigma, questa grande azione basata sull'obiettivo di una fusione civile-militare, cioè di tutto quello che viene fatto sul piano dell'impresa, della ricerca civile, viene utilizzato con la finalità prettamente militare. Ecco, tutto questo è con il paradigma di fare delle forze armate cinesi un gigante tecnologicamente avanzatissimo e imbattibile. Su tutto questo, per la verità, sono caduti da tempo molti veli. Dottor Lohmann, Walter Lohmann diceva chiaramente che ha trovato un vento diverso anche in Europa nei suoi molteplici contatti con governi, con centri di ricerca dell'Unione Europea. Diciamo, anche chi voleva tenere gli occhi per comodo o magari per affari, per facilità di operazioni economiche, voleva tenere gli occhi almeno socchiusi, se non completamente chiusi, adesso deve riconoscere quella che è la realtà della sfida che abbiamo di fronte. Questo fatto, il fatto che ci sia una consapevolezza approfondita, che è stata appunto descritta dal nostro relatore come qualcosa che ha molta presa nel Parlamento americano, soprattutto in Senato, dove addirittura anche una lieve maggioranza di repubblicani potrebbe essere un pungolo per la nuova amministrazione, se sarà insediata finalmente l'amministrazione Biden, un pungolo per essere in una continuità di sostanza assertiva con l'amministrazione Obama, dimostra che non è impossibile, non è certo impossibile rovesciare la situazione di pericolo nella quale ci troviamo dinanzi a questa crisi. Non è vero che siamo così deboli, noi del mondo atlantico, europei, americani e i paesi like-minded, chiamiamoli così, dell'Asia, dell'America Latina, del Pacifico, dell'Oceania, paesi che condividono i nostri valori e la nostra volontà di restare democrazie libere. Ecco, tutto questo, quindi concludo, quindi noi abbiamo delle possibilità di lavorare insieme a fondo e dobbiamo trovare delle vere strategie comuni fra europei e americani soprattutto. Le abbiamo trovate parzialmente su 5G, Huawei. Ci sono molti oramai paesi, anche europei, purtroppo non ci siamo ancora con chiarezza noi italiani, ma sono molti paesi europei che si sono espressi in questo senso. Ci sono le decisioni del vertice NATO di Londra dell'anno scorso che dimostrano come anche la NATO abbia una percezione esatta adesso della sfida cinese. E c'è anche la dichiarazione fatta pochissimo tempo fa, a fine ottobre, dal segretario di Stato Mike Pompeo insieme all'alto rappresentante Joseph Borrell, sull'avvio di un dialogo strutturato, un dialogo strategico che sarà un continuum fra i due lati dell'Atlantico per discutere delle questioni cinesi. Ecco, tutto questo deve riguardare i temi certo delle tecnologie, ma deve riguardare anche le strategie comuni di europei ed americani nelle organizzazioni internazionali, tanto più se Biden deciderà di rientrare nell'Organizzazione Mondiale del Commercio a pieno titolo, di rientrare all'OMS, strategie comuni che devono puntare, oltre a queste vicende, a questi item, a questi dossier che riguardano interessi tecnologici, commerciali e strategici, ma una questione più alta di tutte le altre, a mio avviso, ed è la questione della tutela dei diritti umani universali e dello Stato di diritto. La tutela che deve essere, sulla quale si è espresso il Congresso americano con molta forza, con delle sanzioni in Xinjiang, per Hong Kong, per il Tibet, sulla libertà religiosa, contro le persecuzioni che riguardano il Falun Gong e anche la Chiesa, anche i cristiani. Mi ha colpito la citazione di un collaboratore di Biden all'inizio di questa, di questa vicenda, di questa uscita dalla corsa presidenziale. Gli hanno chiesto qual è la priorità della nuova amministrazione. La risposta è stata Cina, Cina, Cina e Russia. Grazie.
Grazie Giulio, grazie all'ambasciatore Terzi. So, Director Lohmann, obviously we don't have the time to translate everything, but I know you're very familiar. You have frequent talks with Ambassador Terzi, so I'm sure you share much of what he said, and he shares what you said. So we have a couple of questions that have arrived through the chat. If you agree, I will read some of them and ask you to respond as you please. So first, also for those of the audience that send questions, I will go to those that really regard Asia, and then we will move on to some other points. The first question is from Carlo. What, according to Dr. Lohmann, is the bipartisan vision on China's place in the world? Is there such a consensus vision, or is the bipartisan cooperation vis-a-vis China only contingent? A second question from Silvano Berioli. What does Dr. Lohmann mean when he says there is no real US trade policy towards Asia? And what is the weight of the American Senate compared to the Chamber of Deputies? Another question regarding Asia more generally, from Valeriano Paisan. How will a Biden presidency impact India's foreign policy, and what will his presidency mean for North Korea? So a question regarding India, impact of Biden presidency on India, North Korea, and then more questions on the role of Congress, let's say, in the policies towards China.
Okay, thank you. Well, let me start with the trade question, just so I can clarify. The point I'm making is that there is not a trade policy in this administration, in the Trump administration, that is focused in a strategic sense on Asia. You know, it's not a part of a broader strategic approach to Asia, not a broader strategic approach to China. It has its own economic dynamics. It's a part of trade policy. So it's better to look at what we're doing, what the US is doing on trade in Asia. It's better to look at it from the perspective of trade policy generally than to look at it as an approach to Asia. And the downside of that is that we don't really have an economic piece of the strategy that the administration has employed in Asia, because it's all a function of these other politics around trade issues. And that's what I think will continue in the Biden administration. They will be more conciliatory on multilateralism. You know, they will be more amenable to working through the WTO and things like that. But I think it will continue to be a very labor-oriented, protectionist type of trade policy, and that will continue to be a problem, I think, for the United States going forward. China's role in the world, you know, I do think there is a bipartisan consensus that can allow for a China sort of properly constituted from an American perspective, even ruled by the Communist Party, to assume status as a major power. I don't think there is an aversion of the US to allowing China to assume a role in the world as a major power. But I think what's happened in the last maybe 10 years, in some ways 20 years, is developments going on in China that is making it more aggressive and more damaging to Americans' interest as it rises. If we can address some of those issues, if we can address some of the fundamental issues in China with economic reform and some other issues, without removing the Chinese Communist Party, we can address some of those things, I think it would be easier to deal with them. But I don't think fundamentally there's a problem in allowing China, from the US perspective, allowing them a much more active role in the world. It's just the shape that that role takes that is most important. On the House and Senate, well, generally the Senate is more powerful on foreign policy issues. So, you know, that's partly what makes this so important. I mean, Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, in the House of Representatives, basically controls the entire agenda. I mean, if she declares herself to be a partisan of Biden and willing to work with him on his agenda, then the Republicans can't do anything. I mean, they might as well not even go to work, okay? Because there's nothing you can do in the House if you're in the minority party. There's really nothing you can do legislatively. So that's, I don't think that's a threat. But Nancy Pelosi, she did, you know, during the Obama administration, she had her differences with Obama and clashed with him, and a couple times showed him who the boss was on legislation. So it's not something to be taken for granted, but it's just not, it's not as much of a problem. The Senate will be more of a problem. Even if it doesn't get a Democrat majority, it will still cause a problem. And if it gets a Democrat majority, then it will be in position to restrain the Republicans. So you won't have a dynamic where the Republicans are sending legislation to the House, or they're coming up with ideas that are moving, but the president steps in and stops them and he makes them look bad. You know, they won't be, the Republicans won't be in a position to play those sorts of political games, so to speak. And then India and North Korea, U.S.-India relations are on a long-term upward trajectory. I don't think there's anything changing from that. It goes back to the end of the Clinton administration, through the Bush years, where it hit a high point, really, at that point with the U.S.-India nuclear deal. And then it plateaued a little bit, I think, through the Obama years, but still climbing, getting better. And then Trump is actually pretty popular in India. Now they have a vice president who is of Indian ancestry. And so I think it's all good on India relations, in part driven by the Indian American community, who have taken an interest in foreign policy and politics of the United States now. And on North Korea, the thing is with North Korea, they really don't leave you many options. You know, that's why every president gets stuck in this trap with North Korea. There's really no good answers. So they can call it all different kinds of things, but in the end, it's always the same. It's, full pressure on Korea, and you leave North Korea, and you leave open the possibility of some kind of agreement, but agreement is never forthcoming. I don't think those basic things are going to change.
I was muted, so thank you, Director Lohman. If you agree, and if everybody agrees, I would like to pose a last bulk of questions, let's say. Then, unfortunately, we will have to finish this session. But I'm sure, I hope we can come back to you in the future with more questions, and also when policy changes. So one question that has been asked: how much does the fact that China hold a large part of the American public debt weigh on American politics? And then I would also like to ask a question, given your role, given also what Ambassador Terzi said. Under this past administration, it's been very important that the US has pressured, in a way, the European Union, countries of the European Union, to take a stronger stance towards China. We've witnessed this shift very slowly and not equally in all countries. Do you think this will continue? Is this something we should be afraid of, that this pressure goes away? And then the last question from Marco Muggia, which just arrived. According to the recent US importations reduction from China, it appears the US decided to reduce its influence on that area, or more probably, maybe the US knows that this tool cannot be used for making pressure on the Chinese economy anymore? If this is true, could it mean that the only feasible tool is the military strength pressure? So that is the final question for you tonight.
Okay. All right. Thank you. First on the China debt, I really think there's no impact at all. The Chinese invest in American debt because our debt market is the most liquid in the world. It's the biggest. And relatively speaking, it's a good investment. They're not doing us any favors buying American bonds. I mean, I think a bigger problem on the US side, we sell too many bonds. You know, people are always complaining about the deficit, but the problem is we export too many bonds. You know, we shouldn't have such a high debt, but I don't think the Chinese have an option. I mean, were they to dump debt, they would lower the value of their own holdings, which would be a crazy thing to do. So I don't see it. Now they're very slowly unloading some debt, but I think it's in keeping with their overall portfolio. Japanese now actually own more American federal debt than the Chinese. That's a really good question about the U.S.-Europe cooperation on China. Because when I talk to friends in Europe, especially probably in Berlin, they say, well, because there's a little bit of surprise that the Germans have gotten tougher. I don't want to overstate it. They're not gotten that tough, but they've gotten a little bit tougher. There's some surprise, but they say, this is just our internal dynamics working. It's not because you told us to, it's not because of your pressure, it's just because we're doing this. But I'm a little bit worried that once Trump is gone, if he indeed is gone, beginning next year, that there won't be the urgency anymore across a lot of issues, not just ones related to China or Asia, and maybe European friends are not so focused on China as they were with the United States complaining about it all the time. And it doesn't just go for Germany, I think it goes for others. It goes for Italy, and I think it goes for others in the region too. So that's something actually that I'm keeping a very close eye on as well, because I believe, like Ambassador Terzi talked about, our common values and that sort of thing. I believe it's our strongest asset in the world, a transatlantic relationship. And it's one we have to bring to bear together on China, or else we're not going to win, And it's very hard to tell Americans that, because Americans don't like to admit that they need anyone, especially in Asia, because we've been doing this for 70 years. We won the war, we are there, we can do all this. But really, we need everybody if we're going to win this competition with the Chinese. And then imports, again, I get back to the point I made before. I see what we're doing on China on the trade side having more to do with trade politics than with China. I mean, we're not really trying to pressure them in some broad strategic way. We have people in the US government who are interested in protecting certain industries like steel and that sort of thing. And so they're going after those places where they can protect industry. They're not really trying to pressure the Chinese in any meaningful strategic way. I mean, we do have some sanctions in place now on Hong Kong related issues and Uyghur issues. In the end, I think you're just standing up for what's right in those instances. Maybe you keep some things out of the supply chain, say products made in Xinjiang with prison labor, maybe you keep those out of the supply chain, and that's valuable. But China is a big place with a big country complex, just like the United States. I don't see them changing because the United States either tells them to, or because we change some of our economic connections.
Director Lohmann, thank you so much for being with us this evening, for your introductory remarks, for bearing with us in these questions. I hope again that we may talk again in the next coming days. Definitely work together in the future on this issue, which is of primary importance, I would say, to all of us. And as you've highlighted, as Ambassador Terzi highlighted, something we need to cooperate on. And I think there is a common sense of belonging to the idea of democracy, of liberal democracies between Europeans and Americans. So we need to build on this also when it comes to other regions in the world. So thank you again also on behalf of Senator Adolfo Urso, who has been with us from the beginning, but who is acting a bit shy this evening, but he sent me a text to ask you really to thank you for being with us. Grazie anche tantissimo all'ambasciatore Giulio Terzi di Sant'Agata, come sempre puntualissimo su questo tema. Grazie a tutti voi che ci avete seguito, spero che sia stato di vostro interesse, e come ha già rispondervi nei prossimi giorni, anche chi ha semplicemente voglia di discutere, diciamo, di questo tema che per noi è molto centrale. Quindi grazie mille a voi tutti e buona serata. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much.
Thank you very much. Good evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. See you soon. Bye bye.
Grazie.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
You too. Buona sera.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Grazie, buona serata.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Buona serata.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Buona serata.
Buona serata.
Grazie.
Ciao a tutti.
Ciao, grazie.
Ciao.